Hello there, welcome to session ANZ5. This is dealing with uncertainty. My name is Ian Clark and I'm your chair for this afternoon. I'm a director at Flow Transportation Specialists, which is a transport planning consultancy based in New Zealand. New Zealand, the white wall behind you, but there you go. The issue we're grappling with this afternoon is, I think, fairly well understood. That is, the technology improvements are allowing us to improve the quality of our modelling tools, but the accuracy of our forecasts are still clearly dependent on so many variables. So the question is how we deal with all that uncertainty. So to take us through this topic, we have 5 presenters over the next 90 minutes, 1 from New Zealand, 3 from Australia, and 1 from the US. Or to put that differently, we have 1 from a government agency, 3 from private practice of various types, and 1 from a university. So each speaker will have 10 minutes, and we'll hear the 5 presentations back to back, followed by about half an hour for questions. So can I encourage you to put any questions as you think of them in the Q&A session on the far right of your screen. So please use the chat there for general comment, but use the Q&A for questions. The sooner you put them there, the sooner I have a chance to see them and line people up to respond accordingly. So first up, we have Anthony Fransos, who is a principal transport engineer at Arcadis, Asia Pacific. Anthony, or Tony, is based in Melbourne, and he's been dealing in uncertainty and forecasts for, I would say, several years. So over to you, Tony.
Thank you, Ian. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to transport planners and modelers, whenever you are. I want to start with some, oh God, there's a bit of there's a terrible echo here, Ian. Some declaration, I'm going to start with some
Anthony, I would recommend that you make sure that this is the only active tab on your computer at the moment and everything else is closed.
Okay, so sorry, yes, I'm starting with some disclaimers. So firstly, anything I say today is my own opinion and doesn't reflect the opinions of my employers. Secondly, I'm not a research institution, so my opinions are based on my experience in my own narrow scope of time and geography. And that being out of the way, over the last year or two, I have developed a particular interest in the uncertainty that arises from what we don't know, rather than modelling itself. So what we don't know is ineffable. All these other sources of error and uncertainty are, on the other hand, quite effable, and we can measure how they forecast how they affect our forecasts with sensitivity and scenario tests. But what we don't know is something we simply can't talk about, and so that's what I'm talking about today. I'm not a fan of questions on presentation slides. They make me feel like I'm watching other people's children jumping on my furniture. So to like-minded people, I apologize. I hope you don't have nice furniture. But I'm trying to find out how big this influence of this type of uncertainty is. And one illustration is this chart that compares forecasts of Australian Bureau of Statistics for population of Australia 100 years into the future. And they do this exercise quite regularly. This chart compares the forecasts they made in 2008, 2012 and 2016. And they must have done some sort of scenario tests and sensitivity tests and looking at errors and come up with these ranges within which they thought that population might fall. And every 4 years, though, they adjusted these forecasts up quite significantly. And in fact, over the 4 years between the forecasts, it comes to about 6 to 8% per year. And I would argue that these adjustments were made as a result of what the ABS didn't know. They didn't know at the time that they made the forecast. So I've done some surmising and conjecturing about what might be hidden in these, in what we don't know, and I've come up with some suggestions that might be dodgy. And I realize there's a paradox talking about something that we don't know. But there's firstly the fact that our models are quite reductionist, and they have to be, otherwise they're as useful as a map, a one-to-one map of the world. But perhaps what we leave out of our models is contributing to uncertainty. And then there's the intriguing possibility that when we forecast, we change the future. And I'll give you an example of this. About a few years ago, there was a company that presented at a conference. And what they were doing was forecasting at 5 a.m. in the morning, based on road conditions, what the rest of the day would look like on the roads in the city. And then they directed their clients to use the areas of the network that they've predicted would be uncongested. So it doesn't take too much imagination to see how that would change, maybe not the future. Well, it wouldn't change the forecast because that was already done, but it may have changed the future. And then there are the so-called black swan events. One example of this would have been the collapse of the Tasman Bridge in 1975. It connected the eastern and western sides of Hobart across the Derwent River. And for 2 years, the people who lived on the eastern side of Hobart were cut off from the western side, where all the activities were. The eastern side was most residential, the CBD and working places and activities were on the western side. And the result of that, or as a result of that, there was an increase in mental illnesses like depression and agoraphobia. And there were also some of these social and economic impacts that I've put up on the screen. The planners who worked on that on a transport study about 10 years earlier couldn't have foreseen the collapse of the bridge, or they would have planned for it. But also the tragedy would have triggered some changes in the way people thought about travel and travel choices that the planners couldn't have foreseen. And then we come to the principle of uncertainty. So a lot of people may think of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle dealing with subatomic particles in quantum theory. I'm not an expert on that, but there's an equivalent uncertainty principle for the social sciences that I think applies to transport modeling. A version of it for transport modeling would be that the more independent inputs we use in a model, the less likely that the future reality will look like our forecast. This is not a rule of thumb or an estimate of limits of accuracy caused by errors. It's actually a mathematical truth, as much as Pythagoras' theorem. I can't prove this. I'm not an expert on it, but I'd like to try and illustrate the issue based on this chart. So we might make a forecast on some sort of input. Some sort of input that has an uncertainty of, say, plus or minus 10%. And we might define an acceptable forecast that is within 10% of the future reality. But the problem is that our limits of acceptability don't quite cover the full range of possible futures that the inputs cover. And so there's a chance that our future would fall outside our acceptable range. So we then we either need more certainty on our inputs, or we need to expect less from our forecast. The more inputs we use in our models, the larger the chance that the future turns out to be outside of what would deem to be acceptable. So one analysis, if we use 9 independent inputs, there'd be a 99% chance of our forecast falling outside our acceptable range. Nevertheless, I believe that our models are all fine. They're all works of art. But like works of art, need some meditation and interpretation or contemplation, especially their inputs and outputs. So the saying rubbish in equals rubbish out has become such a cliche, I'm not going to mention it today. However, we should acknowledge that all of our inputs are at least a little bit rubbish. It's the extent of the rot that varies, really. Every input we use into our models includes inherent uncertainty and error, and mostly there's not a lot we can do about it except test scenarios and sensitivities. I think the best way to improve our models and our forecasts is to address the issues of the uncertainty principle. We could probably aim to reduce the number of inputs into our models and reduce the range of uncertainty in those inputs. To do this, we'd need to use smaller, simpler models, and perhaps even a whole series of them. And I think it would help if we start our modeling projects with some futurology to define the conditions we might expect at the forecast horizon. We could also define goals for our cities and their communities, and then we'd have some context for measuring the potential success or failure of those scenarios. In the end, I'd say that over the past year, the COVID pandemic has actually showed how relatively unimportant our focus on the peak periods for our transport networks are, but how important they are for keeping freight moving and getting essential workers to work. And at the moment, we're worried about the uncertainty that our pandemic or that the pandemic, not ours, has brought to us and how we recover from it. But in fact, we face a much bigger source of uncertainty from climate change. And I think to get over this, uncertainty, we could perhaps refocus our modeling, develop some new models, or repurpose existing models so that we can keep planning to keep our freight moving and to get people to essential services. We could use our models to identify the most strategic links in our networks and maybe find the best alternatives to those links so that we can make our networks and their constituents more resilient. And we could actually perhaps work with planners of other infrastructure to bring their assumptions or to take account of their assumptions and needs into our models. And that's all I've got to say about that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Tony. So a reminder, we're going to go straight through presentations and questions, please, for the end. There's no questions yet come up on the Q&A. There you're the first one. So thank you. That's the right place to put it, Graeme. Next up is Graeme Belliss. So Graeme is a Principal Transport Planning Evaluator at the New Zealand Transport Agency. The agency is now known as Waka Kotahi. Graeme's recent focus has been on dealing with uncertainty, especially the incorporation of uncertainty in the decision-making process here in New Zealand. Over to you, Graeme.
I'm afraid. I'm afraid you're on mute, Graeme. It's just the controls down at the bottom of the screen. It's the second option along. It will have a red line through it at the moment. Oh. In the meantime, Ian, while Graeme tries to sort out his audio issues, we'd be able to move on to the next speaker, please.
Sure. So that's unfortunate. I could see that Graeme is talking away. Next up, we have who leads the Australian transport planning practice for Mott MacDonald, and that's based in Brisbane in Queensland. She has over 20 years experience in street transport planning and market research. So Kate, over to you.
Great, thanks Ian. Just checking you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Fantastic. I shall just bring my presentation up. Sorry, bear with me. Great. Can you see my screen, the slides?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Really pleased to be here today. Fascinating topic, this uncertainty. So I'm going to talk about scenario planning, but first of all, a quote. This is from someone you may be familiar with, an Israeli psychologist and economist, Danny Kahneman. Repeated studies have shown that human beings have a widespread tendency towards overconfidence, with a strong belief in our ability to predict the future when we cannot. Quite a powerful statement. So imagine for a moment it's 1990 and someone has just described to you what 2021 would become. And you really wouldn't have taken them very seriously. You know, profound digital age changes, global geopolitical upheaval, climate change, and then a pandemic thrown in on top of that. And fast forward to 2021, and our many organisations are increasingly alive to the notion of deep uncertainty about the future, not least because of the global shock of COVID, but also because the world is changing, and the climate crisis alone requires a different future. So planning for the future needs to change, and it needs to change, unfortunately, at a time when everyone's resources are really pretty much stretched. So the real question, how do we as transport planning professionals advise our clients, advise organisations, how do we plan for the future? And I'm going to give a bit more of an overview on that and then delve into scenario planning, so one approach. Before I do, just wanted to make one point about how things have changed, certainly in the last year, and the increasing prominence of what we call the triple access system. So should be just playing a video now, which won't come up. Anyway, what was going to be here is a triangle that some of you might be familiar with, which shows how the triple access systems made up of the transport system, the telecommunication system, and the digital system. So what we as transport planning professionals now are really dealing with is not just transport, it's that whole triple access system. And one of the things that we have found during the events of the last year is that the digital telecommunication system has become so much more important in our lives, and really hammering home that transport planning 101, that transport is a derived demand. So it's something that we do to get somewhere else, it's not something for itself. So another quote. We've already heard mention of the known unknowns, and this is at the heart of uncertainty and at the heart of deep uncertainty. And deep uncertainty really does make us very uncomfortable. And so the tendency is to suppress it and to conceal it. But obviously that's not a viable way forward for any of us. So what is a new way forward? You know, when we're confronted by that uncertainty, what should we do? Well, we do need a new way of thinking, and we need a new way of doing in particular. But really important to recognise that uncertainty is all about subjectivity. So back to the Danny Kahneman and the behavioural psychologists, it's all affected by our underlying values and perceptions. So the orthodox approach to transport planning, which we often talk about as being predict and provide, where you forecast a most likely future and provide a means to achieve that projected future, is very, very strongly ingrained in everything that we do in our guidance and our practice and our norms. It's evolved over decades. So you have a forecast that influences your policy making and investment, and that in turn influences the transport system and the demand, and hence the actual travel levels. But there's a lot of evidence, as we know, that that regime compliant approach is really struggling to cope now. So in essence, we know that planning by looking in the rearview mirror isn't adequate in the face of the opportunities, the threats and the uncertainties that we face. And instead, we need to move towards what we call a decide and provide paradigm. So it's vision-led, and it aims to improve the resilience of planning by taking into account that deep uncertainty about the future. So at its heart, it's about deciding on a preferred future and providing a development pathway that's best suited to achieving that. And this is another way that you can conceptualize it, as I said, moving from a regime compliant approach to a regime testing approach. So getting now into the nuts and bolts of it, scenario planning. So we're talking about deep uncertainty. There's a whole range of techniques that have been developed that enable us to address deep uncertainty. And I'm going to focus in on the scenario development and analysis, which also covers off on some of these other more qualitative techniques that you can see in the table. So what is a scenario? And essentially a scenario is a story. It's a story that describes alternative ways an environment might develop in the future. So each scenario explores how different conditions might support or constrain the delivery of policy and strategy objectives. And the outcome of scenario planning is a shared understanding of the dynamics of change and the conditions and choices facing scenarios under different market conditions. So essentially, scenario planning is used to create a set of plausible do-nothing future scenarios against which you can test do something policy options for their degree of alignment with progressing towards a vision or a preferred future. So plausible scenarios are just a way of managing, exposing uncertainty. And you can have qualitative and quantitative scenarios, very often qualitative feeding into quantitative. As it says here, they don't need to be mutually exclusive. So one of the ways you can think about it is if you have a torch shining it into the darkness, into your dark uncertainty, and the futures cone helps shine a light on that. So there's a beam of light on your plausible futures and your preferable futures. And scenarios are just those plausible future contexts, things that could evolve without policy interventions, and policy interventions change their path. So MacDonald, in partnership with the University of West of England, has developed an approach, a vision-led approach to scenario planning, which has scenario planning at its heart, and that's in the opening out phase that you see here. So I'm just going to touch now quickly on some how that scenario planning approach actually works. So 4 steps really to scenario planning. So firstly, to decide upon a focal question, then to identify your key drivers of change, then to focus on the critical uncertainties, and then to craft the scenarios and give them names. So the first one is the simple one. What is your focal question? You've got your vision, your preferred vision, but what is this? What are you doing this for? What is it that you're aiming to resolve? And then you move into identifying your key drivers of change, and very common to use a PESTLE framework to enable this process. And then with those key drivers of change, and this gets quite challenging, you need to decide on which ones are the most important and the most uncertain. And you can see here, post-its on paper, it's a very participatory approach, scenario planning, very collaborative. And then you get into designing your scenarios and giving them names 2x2 scenarios are the most common, but you can have 3x3, and then also you can have morphological scenarios as well. What you see on the screen here are some scenarios that were developed for Waka Kotahi back in 2014, 2015, when Professor Glenn Lyons was pioneering this approach there. So you've got the two critical axes of uncertainty, the accessibility preference and the relative cost of energy. And then these are some plausible scenario narratives that were developed for the UK Department of Transport just recently. You see the different ways that you can actually present them. And then the final stage is to test your options against your plausible future scenarios. And with this matrix, you can get a view as to which of your options are going to perform best in your plausible future scenarios.
2 minutes left, Kate.
Brilliant. Final slide. 3 slides. So I guess to summarise, what's the advantage of scenario planning? Well, as you can see, you paint a picture, which really does help decision makers to think through the challenges in a way that's quite engaging. So it helps expose uncertainty, it challenges unconscious bias and groupthink, helps focuses on the road ahead, and really captures that de-risking to forward planning. It is an art as much as a science, though. Sometimes it can raise more questions than answers, and there is always a danger that it's divorced from the policy-making process. But just to round up, it's something that I'm sure many of you on the call are already very familiar with, and there is a really growing body of examples of good scenario planning out there. One I'd probably prompt you to look at, the most recent one, is the TRICS guidance on Decide and Provide from the UK. And to finish with a quote from Voltaire. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Great timing. Okay, we'll move straight on to the next speaker, who is Dr. Alexa Delbosc. She is a senior lecturer at the Monash Institute of Transport Studies in Australia, and her biography states that she studies the intersection between the transport system, travel behaviour, and human psychology. Over to you, Alexa.
Thank you very much. There are my slides. Great. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in today's session. I am not a modeler myself, but as mentioned in my biography, my background is more in travel behavior and human psychology. So I hope today's presentation will get you thinking. It's actually a nice complement to Kate's presentation of how we deal with uncertainty in transport, but a caution that you may not have thought of in the past, which is around egocentric bias, which I'll explain what that means in a moment. To take things right back to the basics, how do we make predictions about the transport system? We probably start with basic principles that we may have learned through university or fundamentals of modeling. We bolster those that information with evidence of surveys that we've done or models we're running. Of course, all of this is filtered through our professional judgment, which we build up over many years of experience. But today, I also want to bring attention to this part of the process, our personal experience in life and also in the transport system also plays a role in how we think about, predict, and model the transport system. Humans are not machines. We are subject to a whole range of bias. I loved hearing Kate mention Daniel Kahneman, a psychologist who talks a lot about these heuristics and shortcuts that we use. And of course, these days, we're dealing with absolutely unprecedented uncertainty. Just to take COVID as the example, with second and third waves of infection, with transport shooting up and down as borders open and close, and uncertainty over the trickle down through the economy, through housing. You might ask yourself, do these basic principles even apply anymore? Can we trust the evidence? Can we learn anything from the past or from the present situation? Can we trust our judgment in a time of such uncertainty? And these are all good questions, but the part again that I'd like to focus on today is being aware of how your own experience may color your judgment when you're making these decisions and estimations of the future. And the bias I'm going to talk about today in particular, Kate mentioned the overconfidence bias. The one I'm talking about today is called egocentric anchoring. Now, this is not narcissism. This isn't egocentrism as in thinking the whole world revolves around yourself. That's not what I mean by egocentric anchoring. Egocentric anchoring is when you're trying to make a judgment about another person, an estimate about them. You start with your own personal experience first, and then you adjust that estimate using other information about that person or the situation. So as an example, if I'm trying to guess what your favorite ice cream flavor is, I would probably start with flavors I like and then adjust my estimate. I probably would not start, it probably wouldn't even occur to me to start with flavors like pistachio or Rocky Road because I'm allergic to nuts, so that's not even part of my ice cream experience. It's been looked at extensively within psychology, and myself and a colleague in the United States have had a look at this bias even among transport professionals. Yes, even we are not immune. And an example I'd like to talk through today, because I think it's very relevant at the moment, is let's take the example of trying to understand and guess how much telecommuting or working from home might become part of the future after COVID is finished, right? It's a very hot topic at the moment. A lot of uncertainty, a lot of predictions flying around. A quick Google search, these are not academic studies, but some surveys out there flying around numbers like 99% of current remote workers would like to work remotely in the future. A survey that says 65% of respondents reported wanting to be full-time remote employees. And a third one saying that their best estimate is that 25 to 30% of the workforce will be working from home multiple days by the end of 2021. So when you hear these numbers, do these numbers kind of sound right to you? Are they in the ballpark? Maybe not all of them, but do some of them feel like, okay, I could believe that. Maybe that's similar to something you've read. But why might those estimates feel right? Is part of it because it fits your own experience of working from home during the pandemic? Did you have to work from home at the height of lockdowns? Did you enjoy the experience? Would you like to do it even when COVID is over? And I'd like to even challenge you, if you could, go to the conference room chat window, not the question and answer at the moment, but in the chat window, if you're feeling brave, would you feel comfortable guessing what percentage of Australians worked from home at the height of our pandemic lockdown, which was June, middle of winter 2020? There'll be a little bit of a delay, but I encourage you, maybe write down on a notepad if you don't want to be public, but I do encourage you to just pop into the chat a percentage, what percentage of Australians you think worked from home in June 2020. There is a delay after you type before I can see it. So I will move on, hoping that a few people have been brave enough to put in some predictions. There we go. Thank you very much, Daniel. And hopefully a few more predictions will come in, and you'll see if you were accurate or not. It turns out in June 2020, only 29% of Australians were working from home. And that had a huge range depending on what sector we're talking about. Frontline workers, retail, agriculture, they can't work from home. White collar jobs like communication, finance, closer to 50% or even more. Predictions I'm seeing coming through chat, all of them so far are more than 29%. And I wonder how much of that is because of our own experience during lockdown. We did a survey last year of the AITPM, which is an Australian Association of Transportation Professionals, and 62% of them were working from home during the lockdown. So it was no surprise to me that amongst transport professionals, there is a strong belief that working from home will play this very important role in the future. But let's move beyond our hunches and our personal opinions. Let's have a quick look at the preliminary research coming out. There are research studies already making estimates of how much working from home will continue in the future. A couple examples that I found before this presentation. The first thing to take away from this is almost all of the studies so far are using online panels to give them samples, to give them to fill out their surveys, such as Google consumer surveys. There was actually a recent review that said over 75% of studies on working from home use online panel surveys. Another survey I found analyzed Twitter activities, Twitter responses about working from home. And a third example from very early on in the pandemic, so they were rushing to get some findings out, is they did a survey that was a convenient sample of membership lists of their transport group, as well as members of their own institute. So they asked within a university research group and their associates, how many, how did they feel about working from home? And the issue here is all of these people that they're talking to are more likely to be willing and able to work from home in the first place. People who are doing online surveys, people who are on Twitter, people who are associated with transportation research groups have a particular view of working from home. And how might that impact predictions based on these data? These surveys tend to be missing things like people who are currently unemployed, people who are low income, people with low literacy, let alone computer literacy, very young and very older people who are working. And almost all of these people are people who are less likely to be able to work from home. So if we're not asking these people, how is that going to impact our predictions? And will we even notice when these voices are so different to our own? And even if working from home does increase after COVID goes away, the relative size of that impact is likely to be fairly small. One survey, which did use online sample, but I do know this one at least waited to try to correct for some of the voices they weren't hearing as much, found that working from home might increase from 4.5 to 6%. And we should remember that in the peak hour, not all trips are work trips. So what is the impact on the transport system? How great is it likely to be when this survey from the United States, for example, finds the majority of trips in the peak time are not commute trips?
2 minutes, Alexa.
Good to go. And of course, the impacts of working from home are going to be uneven across locations and industries. Early work suggests that working from home is much more likely for people who work in the center of cities, where people are more likely to have taken public transport before COVID. So how many car trips are actually going to be substituted? And past research on working from home suggests the impacts are complex. If you have a fairly straightforward commute to and from work, then you work from home, then you don't travel. Great. If you have a more complex trip chaining style of work, and that's not necessarily just women, but it tends to be gendered. If you also are driving the kids to school or have to drop them at go to the doctor or grab some groceries on the way home, getting rid of this trip doesn't remove these trips. So all I'd like you to take away from this presentation, if nothing else, is when you're thinking about the future, if you're doing scenario modeling, try your best to step out of your own personal experience of the transport system. Think about what voices you might be missing. You might think about your decision-making teams. How diverse are they? And if they're lacking in diversity, not just, it's not just about gender and age and ethnic background. It's about life experience, life stage, what transport modes you tend to use, what parts of the city you live in, or whether you live outside of cities. How can you hear a wider range of voices when you're making these decisions and predictions? And that's it from me. I'm looking forward to the questions in the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexa. I will kick off by saying I didn't take part in your poll, seeing as I saw your slides this morning, thought that would be cheating. I will say that both the Australian and New Zealand modelling groups have been talking about how to improve diversity. And I think your presentation rather recommends that, because probably we are too monocultural, monogender, you name it. So it's probably food for thought about how we move forward to understand more about what people are doing and why. Moving on next to Monash, who is CEO of a company called Good Judgment. I believe he's quite a regular at Modelling World, and so you'll know that Good Judgment is a company which has a network of super forecasters working on economic, social and investment issues, including transport. I believe Warren is speaking to us from New York. Welcome.
I am. Good day, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So let me get my screen going. And hopefully that's coming through too.
Yes.
Great, thanks. So, well, like Alexa, I'm not directly involved in transit modeling, but we do a lot of work with firms and organizations that do. And I can also say, well, that personally, transit issues are quite close to home for me. Here is where I am, right here in New York, and you'll see I'm smack dab at the intersection of one of the largest bus stations in the country, the Port Authority, the largest train stations, Penn Station, and one of the main arteries coming into the city, Lincoln Tunnel. In fact, right there on the right, you'll see my bird's eye view of the middle tunnel for the Lincoln Tunnel, and I can tell you traffic is flowing smoothly at the moment. I'll be sure to let you know if that changes. But more seriously, so what we are is a firm where we have a panel of very accurate forecasters where we combine human judgment with crowdsourcing techniques and state-of-the-art algorithms and machine learning tools born out of a US government research project, and we've built a company on it. And one of the things that happened last year was a lot of the traditional approaches to thinking about uncertainty broke down. A lot of them are very heavily dependent on fixed models and fixed data sets, assuming equilibriums that themselves broke down. And so how do we quantify uncertainty in that world? There's a lot more room for human judgment. And we did quite well with a number of questions on COVID caseloads globally and by country, timing of vaccines, vaccination rates, and so forth. And Time Magazine did a little, it was a nice story talking about how the forecasts are eerily accurate, but there's really nothing eerie to it. It's really all about process. And by having this process, we can get very accurate forecasts. And what I mean by forecasting here is to think probabilistically about the future and do it by quantifying as much uncertainty as possible. So instead of having a hunch about the future, well, something might happen or there's a distinct possibility, we assign a number. And the very good forecasters will give you reliable calibration. That's what this graphic is showing, summarizing thousands of individual forecasts that have been aggregated, so that when the super forecasters say there's an 80% chance of something occurring, 80% of the time it does, 20% of the time it does not. They're very accurate that way. And here's an example of a question we have posed currently, right here in what we're talking about here, asking about the UK and what percentage of working adults will be exclusively working from home. This is a question we posed back in October. The most favored outcome is 10 to 20%. That remains it. And so we quantify that number at 78% is the number we'd be looking for. So the advantage of that is we can score it and we can provide inputs into other models by quantifying uncertainty and not just using vague verbiage. Now, just some key best practices, and these are tools that you can use on top of whatever you're already doing. It's not instead of, it's in addition to. And a very basic thing is to start with a base rate. So when you're thinking about uncertain events, what does history tell us? It's what Daniel Kahneman calls the outside view. So you start and find base rates, comparison classes, same idea, and then you work in, rather than start on the particular right at the outset. Then you make comments as you make forecasts, so you can check your thinking along the way, and you can also share your views. This is very important, and challenge other views, and more on that in a minute. Then also make updates. As your views change, make updates and keep score. And by keeping score of your forecasts, you can identify the better forecasters, and forecasters themselves can get better. There's a lot of data behind that. But let me just zero in on the challenge assumptions part. I think might be useful and fit in nicely to the discussion so far. And I wanted to just highlight two tools that you can use to challenge assumptions. One is something that's very good to do all the time, and it's this idea of red teaming. When you're framing the question you want to ask and you want to unpack the assumptions, a good way to do it is to make sure that you're not being complacent and red team. The idea is to challenge whatever a prevailing view is. And you can do it in your own head, or you can do it on your team. You can do it when you're forming the questions that you're going to ask yourself to make sure you're posing a question that will inform your decisions. And also, as you're forecasting, challenge the other people on your team or in your group and disagree without being disagreeable. It becomes safe to disagree and to change your views. Another very potent tool is this idea of pre-mortems. This is a concept from Gary Klein predominantly. And so like at the end of a big project, it's really good to do a post-mortem. You know, how did it go? What did we learn? How can we do better? You can do the same exercise as a pre-mortem, where especially when the team is coalescing around a particular viewpoint, you can have a very rigorous discussion and ask yourself, if our forecast doesn't align with reality, what will the headline say 6 months, 12 months, 18 months from now, whatever it might be? And it's also a safe way to challenge high status figures too, because, you know, who wants to take on the boss? Well, you know, boss, you are completely right. But, you know, if reality goes a different way, why might that be? And it's a safe, good, effective tool. We find it very, very helpful, especially when there's a narrow range of views. So I just wanted to give an example of that. This is one that's, well, here in New York, there's a view that is pretty dominant. It's not universal by any means, but it's pretty dominant, that New York transportation needs will return to normal. Now, what's the base rate? Well, back in 9/11, there's a lot of speculation that, well, nobody's going to come back to a city that was attacked by terrorists. They did. Then in the global financial crisis in 2008, a lot of people said, well, no one's going to come back because the finance industry has disappeared. Well, it didn't, and people didn't go away. Same thing with Hurricane Sandy. Who's going to want to live in a floodplain? But once again, people stayed. And so this is the base rate. This is what history tells us, at least recently, about what's going on. So what do you do when you do a pre-mortem? Well, I did that with a panel of experts and forecasters, just to do a quick analysis on how we might challenge that prevailing view. And these are some of the topics we're already talking about here. One is, well, people won't return to work, at least every day. So if that happens, that's a change to that equilibrium that prevailed before. It's going to be different. Corporations might embrace work from home to save money, especially here in Manhattan, where commercial rents have been huge. They collapsed, but they have been huge. And then as a result, you think it through, and new transportation construction could come to a shuddering halt in cities, but boom in the exurbs, where people will want to have more transportation to move around where they're now preferring to live. So what happens here is it prompts new questions that we can forecast. Let's quantify what these risks are that we've just identified and ask, what will the share of work from home be, say, in 2022? Or what's the construction ratio of urban areas versus exurbs in 2023? And then you can have this be an ongoing process where you are coming up with questions that are important. You start forecasting them, you do pre-mortems, and that uncovers further areas of potential uncertainty that would otherwise be missed and can be very important to quantify to improve overall decision making. So I hope that was helpful. Those were just a few of the key points that I thought might be interesting for you all. I hope they were.
Great, thank you, Warren. And now we'll go back to Graeme, who we couldn't hear before. Let's hope we can hear him this time.
I'll see if you can hear me now.
I can hear you, yes, great.
Excellent, good, right. Right, hopefully that comes up on the screen.
Yep,
So-
we can see that.
As I was talking before, and none of you could hear me, this is about how we bring uncertainty through into the decision making and investment decision making, and how we incorporate it rather than just sort of have it as a factor that's sort of added on and generally ignored. So I'll also start off with a quote, and it's from a former chairman of General Electric, saying that no amount of sophistication is going to allay the fact that all of your knowledge is about the past and all of your decisions are about the future. But that's not really new, because times have always been changing. I know all of our parents have probably said to us, well, it's not like it was in my day, and I know some of us have said that to our kids as well. And so that whole sort of change is not a new thing. We talk about it accelerating. There have been times in the past where it's probably been as quick or quicker. It's just that we now tend to analyze it and tend to try and predict it. The models that we use are a mix of empirical and mechanistic models, and even some of the individual processes within the models are a mix of empirical and mechanistic. So some of these can respond to changes in the environment, and some of them, the actual environment we're talking about is actually built in and inherent in the relationships that are in them. So it tends to be pretty tricky taking them out to the future. We tend to have very simple models of demand with a lot of proxies and largely empirical. We have, at the same time, quite detailed models of the system response. And a lot of the development of models with the expansion of computing power and analytical methods and that have been in the models of system response. And what we've ended up with is lots of models in both of these areas, both demand and response, which are very sensitive to variables that we can't predict with any certainty. So we predict them anyway. And the big thing is we tend to predict them for distant horizons, largely driven by two things, really: sort of long lead times for development of infrastructure for transportation, but also the desire to look at long time periods for determining the sort of the economic payback from these things. One of the problems is we often only pick one horizon. So if we look at our current approach, and we put all our sort of investment planning in that, we sort of got it wrapped around with the business case approach, and that has sort of successive refinement of proposals as we go through, but it's one-sided. And what I mean is we get refinement in the supply side and what we intend to do about things, but we don't really refine the scenarios that we're actually testing them against as we go through. So what tends to happen is we develop more confidence as we go through around an unlikely scenario. And going on to scenarios, we develop scenarios and tend to use them at a strategic level when you're saying, okay, what are the sort of big options for the direction of development of areas and of cities and stuff. But that scenarios are often narrowed before the choice of the most appropriate interventions in transport terms. And those future scenarios that we look at are also often politically negotiated, so that it has sort of, we use a particular scenario. Like if we look at Auckland at the moment, we ask them why that scenario is being used. It's because it's been agreed, rather than, well, this is on balance and on the analysis that we've done, this is the most likely thing to happen. We've heard a bit in the last couple of days about the use of some stochastic models. They have very limited use, or are used in limited ways. They deal with variability rather than uncertainty, and tend to be limited to system response. Sensitivity testing is another way we sort of handle some of that unknowns, but it's usually carried out on outputs from models, not inputs to models. So that we're not really looking at how sensitive are decisions to the changes that we may see in the conditions that lead to those decisions being made. Sometimes there's a matrix approach taken where you've got sensitivity by varying a number of these outputs, but not often. So it's usually crude, simplistic, and relatively unhelpful. And the other thing that's often used, or rather misused, to quote ranges of economic indicators. So a sensitivity test, they may look and say, okay, what happens if our health benefits from take up of active modes varies by plus or minus 20%. And so that just gives you an idea of the way that the economics for the whole proposal may stack up. But then it's often used to say, oh, a BCR therefore would be in a range of 1.2 to 2.1. So those sorts of ranges don't really reflect the variability that you think you may get. So we talked about stochastics. It's useful for some things, and this is just an example of where it's used in looking at the outputs of models and what we think typical BCRs may be given the information we have at the time that they've been calculated. But once again, this is applied to the outputs of models. So it's just applied to the conditions that we have modeled, not applied within the models themselves. One area that we've been looking at quite seriously through some research that we commissioned was the idea of dynamic adaptive pathways or adaptive management, which sort of hinges off a lot of real options analysis and things like that. And this is not so much a modeling thing, although it does have implications for model about how you use models, but this really comes down to how decisions are made and how decision making is seen as when we're investing in particularly infrastructure, where point is just an end point. It is not what we're saying we're developing, and that is the result of a progression, and at each stage along that progression there are decisions to be made. And this has promise, but it requires the whole sort of decision-making process to actually align itself to this, which is quite difficult. The other issue with it is what happens when unexpected things happen. And I'm calling it a white swan here, mainly because all swans native to Australia and New Zealand are actually black. So for us to see something totally unusual, it would be a white swan. And these tend to crop up along a progression towards an endpoint or towards where we're going. So to actually break into the decision-making pathway and to insert something different is really important. And this is where flexibility comes in. And remembering from Pilo's presentation yesterday that the valuing and the using of flexibility is very, very important. But decision makers, they're the people who are going to be acting on whatever comes from our analysis and further work on it. They often don't or won't understand technical information, and that is not unusual. They don't want to try and assimilate a lot of things and end up going down rabbit holes. Many of us have been working for decades in this area, and we're still sort of professing puzzlement. They want to make a logical, they want to make a logical and informed decision, and they want to tell people about it. So they don't want ifs, buts, and maybes. And they certainly in that one don't want backtracking or are uncomfortable with it at the moment. They often confuse uncertainty with reluctance to do anything. And they don't like flexibility because it smacks of indecision and timidity. So how can modelers help in this area? And I've got a couple of pictures there saying more of this, which is the speculation and use of scenarios before delving into the detail. And it's become a bigger part of the modelling. What I'm saying about that is make modelling a part of what you're advising. Expand and simplify the models and interpret them. Focus on impacts and outcomes and value flexibility. Now that's not just when you're saying, hey, what's the value of an intervention, and flexibility has a value just the same as saving travel time or saving crashes does. It's also valuing flexibility in the modelling approaches and remembering that it's a pathway to an end point, and with intermediate horizons being very, very important. So it's really not presenting modelling work as outputs from a model, but presenting it in sort of terms of, from my analysis, which includes elements of modelling, I make these particular conclusions. Part of my job will be to try and get those messages through to the decision makers. And it's so that we can help decision makers make decisions based on looking at the way things are connected and fit together, and not only on very, very detailed views, and in this case, the eyes of a jumping spider. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Graeme. We've got nearly half an hour left for questions. Use Chairman's prerogative to kick things off himself. It's probably a question for Graeme. I like the phrase you just used because it worries me when we go to give evidence to a public inquiry, or we call it here environment court. People like to have precision and like to be us firm and concise, which rather conflicts in giving a range of answers. And I think Graeme referred to it smacking of indecision and timidity. So is there a problem that we have in trying to be precise, but then give a range of imprecise answers in terms of the weight our evidence is given? I'll start with Graeme on that one because given that he was talking about that sort of issue.
I think there's a couple of things here. First of all, when we're talking about being precise, we often confuse precision and accuracy. When we're talking about forecasting, I mean, I believe accuracy simply has no place in the conversation, because we can't know if a forecast is accurate because we can't know until it happens. And so we can talk about confidence. The fact is that the only thing we know about our view of the future is that it's wrong. And that if we aim for precision and keep aiming for precision, we just get more and more precisely wrong. And we spend an inordinate amount of time and money on getting more precisely wrong without communicating what the impacts and implications of that are. And I think that's, if we talk more about the impacts and the outcomes rather than the outputs of our models, I think we can hopefully pull back a little bit of the spiral into sort of precise wrongness.
Thank you. I will let other people, if they wish, also to answer these questions. So if you wish to do that by either unmuting or showing your face on the screen. But at this stage, I might move on to what was the very first question from Graeme Moonsey. I'll put this one to Anthony Fransos. He was maybe sarcastically saying, is the best way of dealing with uncertainty to build more than one model? What do you think of that?
Well, I don't know if it is sarcastic or not, but yes, I think Graham's 100% correct. And I did kind of address it. Should I put my video on? I did kind of address it in my presentation. The trick though is to not have, say, several versions of the same type of model. Rather, I think have a number of different, smaller, simpler models than what we use now, and perhaps use different inputs into each of them, and get an overall view of the future from that. And I see just Graham's also asked about probabilistic modeling, and that's probably another issue. In fact, I have actually used at risk in some of our forecasting. Quick answer, yes, you're right, Graeme.
Thank you. There's probably a quick question from Steve for Warren. I think he was picking up on a statement from Warren, so he's asking, is there such a thing as an accurate forecast?
Well, yeah, so Graeme and I can agree to disagree on that point. Of course, I think there is such a thing as an accurate forecast, and the way you can establish that is over a lot of forecasts. You keep score, and you find out if an individual or a group is delivering a probabilistic forecast that aligns with the outcome over time. Here's a very mundane example. Meteorologists make forecasts all the time, and we can evaluate whether they are accurate. If they say there's an 80% chance of rain next weekend, well, it doesn't take many weekends to find out if that 80% forecast is accurate. They have a track record that you can rely on to have more confidence in the forecast that they are making. Now, Graham's right that on any individual forecast, we can't know until the event resolves. But if there's a track record of accuracy on that event or similar events, then yeah, we should have confidence in that forecast. And we should have, and I think it can be very, very helpful then, just like with weather forecasts, to be able to make more use of it and feed it into other models. So yes, is my answer.
Okay, I'll stick with Warren. There's a question here again from the same chap, Graeme Moonsey, who is on the fire in terms of asking questions. He asks, has the Good Judgment Project ever been tasked with forecasting travel demand, particularly thinking of traffic on a road? And how did you fare? And what were the lessons learned?
We've done forecasting on travel-related topics, airport openings, cruise lines, and the like. We haven't done toll roads. Could certainly be applied to toll roads. And if you're interested in knowing more about the track record of the travel-related questions, just get in touch. I'd be delighted to share that with you or anybody.
Thank you. There was also a question, it was for Kate, but I think anybody could pick this one up if they want. Clearly, pandemic of the last 12 months has been extreme, but had anybody looked back at what responses there had been to anything that could be considered to be something similar? Or were we really guessing in the dark of what the effects would be when COVID first came along? So I'll ask Kate, but I'm not sure it is really a question for Kate.
Well, I'll give a response anyway, Ian, just because I think it's quite fascinating. I was involved in a scenario planning exercise with a local authority here back in March last year. And we crafted a set of scenarios that we'll be using throughout the project. The point is, though, that we were doing this in March, the beginning of March. And we had a big group of people in the room, and not one of us, none of us, identified what we saw unfolding all around us at that particular point in time, a pandemic as part of one of those future scenarios. We are so resistant and insistent upon what we know in our own minds. It's astonishing what it takes to lever us out of that.
Okay.
I think.
Oh.
No, go, Alexa.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on the question, because I do know, at least in predicting public transport travel during and after COVID, I do know my colleague Graeme referenced past smaller epidemics of SARS, for example, in order to get that understanding. I can't remember what Warren called it. You referred to it in your presentation about what's happened in the past in New York City. Okay, when 9/11 happened, people still went back to transit. What was the term you used for that? I like that term.
Phase wave, or outside view at the annual conference.
Yep. And so I'd seen him graphing demand for transit after 9/11, after SARS, et cetera, to try to get an understanding of, okay, in past events that we think were similar, but this was early on in the pandemic, not knowing how long the pandemic would last. We now are at a stage where we realize that it is a bit unprecedented in its length and uncertainty of peaks and troughs. But early on, at least, there was some work in that area.
Okay, another question from me, given that the Q&A appears to be drying up a bit. Are we trying to forecast too far out into the future, given the high level of uncertainty that we do have in the very short term? Is 60 years a plausible target? Maybe I can pick on Tony again.
Yeah, look, you know, in Melbourne, it took, I think it was 40 years from the time it was, the idea was conceived for the Eastern Freeway to go from conception to opening. So really, we should, if we're going to evaluate the need for these projects, we need to at least make some attempt. So I don't know that it's a plausible target, but we need to make some attempts. I think what we do wrong, though, is this business of doing BCRs and evaluating against a do-nothing scenario. I think what we should rather do is have this, we should have an idea about what we want our future cities to look like and what we want our children to experience, and then evaluate these bits of infrastructure. Even if it is 60 years out, we should evaluate them against that goal rather than against the do nothing. And rather than evaluate a single piece of infrastructure, I think we should approach these as scenarios with combinations of infrastructure. So we might not get the outcome right, but at least we'll have made some plans and aimed at a goal rather than aimed at what we shouldn't do, if you know what I mean. So maybe not plausible, but I think it's necessary.
And how about you, Graeme? Any comment on that sort of topic? How far out we're looking?
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Tony in that it's necessary to have those long-term views, but you notice I speak in the plural there, because I think it's necessary to have alternative views long-term, and have the ability to move from one view to another as things pan out. So it's really the sort of case of being able to do things that aren't based on having to reach that particular state in the future. And I think having the scenarios are a combination of physical things that are happening, but also time. And I think the development of the time series of scenarios and the development of that and the propagation of scenarios is an area where I think would be really, really helpful and allow us to have that long-term view without losing that sort of short-term direction.
Okay.
Could I add something to that?
Sure.
Yeah, so one approach that we found to be interesting and valuable is to combine scenario planning tools with our forecasting approach. It fits hand in glove in many ways. And there's an article by Phil Tetlock and Peter Skoblick that was in Foreign Affairs back in November, I think it was, that lays this out. We've also done it in a few other projects, but I encourage you all to take a look at that if you're interested. And basically the idea is that scenario planning is a great tool to tell us about all the plausible futures and narrow those down, cast a wide net, and now which ones are plausible. Then we can use another tool from scenario planning, signpost questions, to get a little bit more refinement. So, and use a PESTLE framework or the like to come up with signpost questions. If we're moving into this scenario, what would the world look like a year or 2 or 3 or 4 from now? Or versus that scenario or some other scenario. Okay, now we've got testable propositions that tell us about what path we might be on, and then we can then quantify those questions with a good, talented, accurate panel of forecasters to get more insight about which of those plausible scenarios is more possible than others.
Okay, thank you. I might move on to the next question. It was alluded to just now, which was Graeme Moonsey's one about probabilistic modelling. And does the panel believe there is a role for following the cost estimators in using like an at-risk approach to deal with uncertainty in demand modelling? And I'll let whoever wants to answer that one have a go.
I'll start. I mean, I've worked on a couple of business cases where they do some sensitivities of the BCR by doing P50s and P25s and P75s, but only vary the costs. And I've always found that a bit strange, because you're not really getting a real variation of your BCRs if you're not looking at a variation of benefits as well. And again, I think Graeme's right on both of these questions.
Maybe I can try to use the answer with reference to the various questions. Somebody asked about toll modelling. Somebody asked about where has there been flawed modelling. And you might add 2 and 2 together on that one, because if toll modelling use an at-risk approach on some of the demands, that may give you some useful information on what your likely forecast range is for that toll model. So I'm aware of some toll models that have had struggles to make money due to flawed modelling. Anyone else want to comment on that, or be knowledgeable in that area?
Look, I don't think that those toll models, I don't want to make any judgments here, but I don't think those toll forecasts were particularly about the models themselves. I don't think if you tweak the models in any way, or if you added extra feedback loops, I don't think the answers were terribly wrong. This is something that really bugs me, actually, because anybody who's worked on these projects knows the pressure that transport modelers come under from the constructors and the financiers who really want to win this toll model, the operations of, and in the end, I think we've ended up with our models and our professionals under a cloud, whereas the real culprits, being the bankers and the constructors, have just walked away scot-free like they usually do, if you pardon my cynicism.
I will chip in again from models I've seen where the reporting of a modelling project did clearly specify some of the caveats which some people reading that report may have not have wished to have taken account of. Clearly, our job is to make sure that the caveats are very clearly stated. Unless anyone else wants to chip in on that, I'll move to another question. I think Alexa's got one coming her way because there's a question from an anonymous person around to what extent is modelling in a silo, and are we doing enough to integrate the outputs of modelling with other disciplines? Feel like a leading question to say yes, no, but I'll let you go for that one.
I'm not inside the tent of modelling, so I'm not sure I'm qualified for that one, but I would love to respond to Stephen's question about uncertainty and then speaking to decision makers.
Go for it.
I could choose my question to respond to. I'll be a politician and answer the question I wish I'd been asked. Again, I'm not inside the tent, but from what I have seen and experienced with that interplay between forecasts and politicians and decision makers, politicians want to be the hero. You know, they want to promise big and deliver big. But when it comes to transport, the advice that I have absorbed that I wish that more decision makers would take on board is to underpromise and overdeliver. And you see it with the Olympic Games. The cities that promise transport will work great and everything will be perfect, and it ends up being a disaster. Nobody can get anywhere. The cities where they say it's going to be really tough, right? Everything's going to be busy. So if you can stay home, do this, do that. The cities tend to actually work better because those predictions change behavior. We're seeing the opposite at the moment with the rollout of vaccines in Australia. The government promised big, but there's so much uncertainty, and now they're under-delivering and they're copping it again and again. So if part of that conversation when they're trying to make decisions and they want the perfect answer could be that if you're just a little bit more modest and a little bit more open about these uncertainties and things work out, one would hope that you'd be rewarded more by the population than if you come in guns blazing saying, this is the project, we're going to be great, it's going to be delivered on time, under budget, and we'll have these perfect outcomes. Of course, reality will get in the way and they're going to cop it. So that would be my response to that question.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that topic? Is a good topic.
Ian, could I just jump in?
Sure.
Sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, I think it's one of the things that's not really talked about enough in this whole uncertainty space is that it is a really uncomfortable topic for most people. Certainly anyone who's been involved in transport planning or modelling for a couple of decades or so, it's even for us it's uncomfortable. And what's not talked about is the change that is going to be required across all our organisations in how we deal with it and how we manage it. So, alongside development of the models, there's a whole change management process pretty much that needs to happen, changing the culture of organisations, changing the way they work, changing the way that they approach making decisions, and changing the way that we judge success in what good decision making looks like. And I don't know, I always come back to something that John Polak once said when he was asked, what's transport planning all about? And he said it's about bringing honesty into the debate. And I think we need to now work in partnership with our clients, as I say, to help all of us transition to this new way of making decisions.
Thank you. So that's really backing up this thing about being very upfront around the shortcomings or caveats or key assumptions and being honest about what we don't know. Anyone else want to chip in on this one, or should we go to the next question?
I'll chip in on this one. Just a couple of things was politicians, well, they like, as you say, they like the big things, the big promises. The bigger the promise, the less likely they're going to have to deliver anything because of the lead times and just the development times for transport infrastructure. By the time it's delivered, they're probably well out of the political game anyway. So that's always one of the things. And about sort of getting this uncertainty and it's uncomfortable for decision makers. I think the hardest part of the lot is actually getting the concept to the decision makers. From my point of view, I've got something like 4 layers of bureaucracy between me and the people who make decisions on projects that I make recommendations whether or not they should be included in the programs of investment. Many of those recommendations will simply not reach decision makers because there are so many layers of different agendas in between them. So I think that is going to be one of the hardest parts, is actually the decision-making process itself, and getting the decision makers, the actual decision makers, really engaged with the whole concept of uncertainty.
We've got 3 minutes left. We've got one more question that's not on the thing. Pilo's presentation at the opening session yesterday talked about the main challenges being inequality or inequity and climate change type environmental issues. So those 2 topics work well with scenario planning rather than, let's say, conventional travel time savings. Anyone who wants to chip in on that can have a go.
With I think Kate said it most succinctly, is moving away from predict and provide and into decide and provide. At the end of the day, to me, what we need to do is decide as a society what we want from our transport system and from our society in the future. If we want greater equity, if we want to respond to climate change, it sets a completely different landscape for decision making than the traditional predict and provide in the past.
Thank you. Rather than artificially squeeze in a last question, does anyone have anything burning to say for half a minute each, or are we okay? In that case, rather than squeeze in this last question, I think I'll just thank you all for your time. Thank you to the 80 people who have listened in, and look forward to hearing the rest of the conference. Goodbye.